We have 7 participants on right now.
All right.
So wait a few more seconds and then we'll get started as people start to sign on. There are 9 participants now. You can take it away, Trevor.
So what do you need me to do?
You're live. You can just start us up.
Well, welcome everybody to this tribal webinar. Thanks for joining us. Bob, do you have anything you want to say about the logistics of using this format?
Only that there is a question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can use that to make comments or ask questions, and Trevor will handle the questions at the very end, or we will follow up. Ethan will get a copy of those. And so with that, feel free to start. Ethan, you want to start your presentation?
Yes. I'll share my screen real quick. Yeah. Oops. So, welcome. Heyan Kamalio, Ahoyet, Tisdale, Tawito Anotet. Hello, my relations. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Red Eagle, and I'll be facilitating tonight on tribal consultation. A little bit about me. It's customary for natives to introduce, their family and their tribe. So my name's Ethan. My family name is Lawton. My native name is Coakbuck, but Red Eagle is a lot easier to say. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska. From 4 tribes. One of my tribes is from Inupik, and we're part of the Inuit, and we're in Northwest Alaska. Our family village is Kotzebue. I'm also quarter Sioux, specifically Lakota, and we're based in the Dakotas, north and south, and we're part of the 7 council fires. I'm also a quarter Navajo, part of the Bitterwater clan. We're based in the Four Corners region, and we're formerly known as Dene, and that means the people in Navajo. I'm also a quarter Tohono-O'odham. We're based in southern Arizona, and our family village is Gatka, and I'm an enrolled member there, and we're formerly known as Papago. I have about 13 years of intercultural specialists in the professional realm and about 8 years of tribal liaison professional. And I've been with SHN for about 4 years now. Over the years, I've been professionally involved with 50 tribal governments throughout the nation. I've personally traveled to over 100 reservations myself and have interacted with over 150 tribal members in different capacities throughout the nation. I have a few disclaimers. One is I'm not speaking on behalf of all the tribes. This is just a general introduction into tribal consultation for your enhancement purposes. And I do encourage that you talk with local tribal communities to improve government-to-government relationships. My second disclaimer is that this is no way legal advice. I do recommend California Indian Legal Services for legal advice, but this is just for general and educational purposes. This is part of our tribal series. This is the third one. The first one we've done was cross-cultural etiquette, and this covered just some things to keep in mind when meeting with tribal representatives. And I did one this year on tribal sovereignty, introduction into tribal governments, and this one's tribal consultations. There's a few that I'll be doing in the future. One next month is on tribal lands, the difference between fee and trust and jurisdiction and authority and different things like that. And next year I'll cover cultural mitigations and tribal confidentiality. Some of you got to attend the tribal sovereignty, and so I'm glad that you are continuing to stay involved. So this is the layout of the presentation for today. We just did the welcome and introduction. I'll cover cross-cultural components. I'll cover the federal, state, and county consultation. I'll cover project-specific consultation. I'll cover local government consultation. And then I'll cover other, which doesn't exactly fit into either of the other ones. And then at the end, we'll have questions and answers. So feel free to type your questions and answers into the chat box. I can't really see those, so we'll have to go over those at the end. And then feel free to unmute yourself at the end for questions and answers. So that was the welcome and introduction. Then we'll dive into the cross-cultural component. So I have an exercise. I want you to picture a dog. When I say dog, what comes to your mind? Okay, now that you have that in your mind, does it look kind of like this? This is kind of what a dog would look like on the res. It's kind of like a big rodent. You definitely don't have dogs inside. You don't spend money on dogs. It's just a difference in culture. And I've traveled to other parts of the world like China, and dogs are unique in regards to relationships, and it varies according to culture. This is another picture of a dog. I remember when I was in San Diego, I saw a dog in a stroller, and I was like, wow, that dog is living a better life than a lot of people that I know. And so the reason why I use this as an example is that culture is different. The way we think things, the way we perceive things, the way we live life, and life is impacted, it varies. Our values, our customs, society, what is considered normal, differs. And I just wanted to preface all of this on why consultation is important, because it's the joining and bridging of two different cultures. Then there's cross-cultural communication. There are several factors that go into communication cross-culturally. First is what was meant. When you're trying to convey something, you first have to start off with what was meant. And then that is impacted and fuels into what is said. So what you meant and what you said, there could be a break in that. Or there could be clear conveyance, and that's part of communication and what is given. Then there's what was heard. Oftentimes, what was said and what was heard is there's a huge break in communication. And so this is what's received on the receiving end. And then from what was heard, there's also another translation to what is understood. So there's so much that goes on in cross-cultural communication that all four of these are important. What was meant, what was said, what was heard, and what was understood. And a breakdown can happen in between any of these on what was given and what was received. Just as it's important to keep all of these in mind, it can fuel it in a positive way, or it could fuel it in a negative way. And so these are just some things we have to keep in mind in cross-cultural communication, especially in consultation. Ideally, you have two cultures that somewhat overlap. And this is where the communication happens. This is where the consultation happens. And so we have there culture A and culture B, and that highlighted in between. What happens when there's a lack of communication or a lack of consultation is cultures can be so divided in communication, divided in understanding, divided in, there can be the chasm can grow ever wider, or it can grow close. And so these are the two choices. There should be two goals. The first goal should be to be seen, to see the other person. And the second goal is to be seen. In other words, we want to see the other person and we want to be seen ourselves. There's a saying in Africa, to see and to be seen. And I thought that was phenomenal based on their tribal groups of their greetings also, to see and to be seen. And so these should be the two goals in regards to cross-cultural communication. These should be the goals in consultation as well. So when cross-cultural communication, when it's done properly, you have culture A and culture B, or however many cultures are involved as well. They are involved in this beautiful dance, and they exchange information and they build relationships and trust. And so that's why cross-cultural communication is so important and vital, especially in consultations. So I just wanted to preface all of this before we dive into the consultation components. So with that, let's begin with the different types. We're going to go broad and then work our way down to local government. So first is the federal government, the United States, and then I'll briefly touch on state and briefly on county. First, the federal government has always taken a stance on consultation. Even in regards to treaty making, the federal government has made treaties with tribes, and it involved an intense consultation process. And even from the beginning of the nation, of the United States, they've always treated tribes as sovereign. And only the US federal government can negotiate treaties with sovereign entities. And so this is kind of the beginning of the consultation process, especially at the national level. And so the US recognizes this. And if you were a part of the tribal sovereignty and tribal government training, I went immensely in depth on that as well. And so we see that that Indian tribes occupy a unique position within US society. No other political entity possesses the same status. And even the US Supreme Court described Indian tribes as quasi-sovereign and semi-dependent, possessing attributes of sovereignty over both their members and their territory, while also being subject to plenary power of Congress. And so even the tribes weren't even considered limited or bound by the US Constitution because they were seen as predating the US Constitution and predating the founding of the United States of America. And so we see that even the federal level, on the national level, there's always been a huge emphasis on consultation with tribes. There are numerous acts and laws and different things like that that strengthen and embed and codify consultation with tribes. These are a few of them. They're embedded in the American Indigenous Religious Freedom Act, Archaeological Resources Protection Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so we see that there are numerous venues for tribal consultation, even on the federal level, all the way going back to the founding of the nation. I included some quotes. One is from Bill Clinton, president, and he required all federal agencies to conduct business with tribes on a government-to-government basis, respectful of their sovereignty. He said the right of Indian tribes to self-government, and that requires federal agencies to work to protect tribal trust resources and Indian tribal treaty and other rights. Then President Barack Obama required federal agencies to engage in meaningful consultation with tribal governments prior to taking any action that may impact tribal interests. And so we see the federal government has taken a strong stance on the need of consultation with tribes and the importance of it as well. Now, the state of California has also taken a similar stance. They formed the Native American Heritage Commission in 1976. They instituted SB 18, which I'll dive more in depth later on. Even Governor Brown signed an executive order in 2011, creating the position of the governor's tribal advisor, reinforcing the importance of tribal consultation. And then there's AB 52, which I'll also touch on later. So the tribal advisor's office to the governor was instituted because of an executive order that he signed. And the tribal advisor reports directly to the governor and oversees the implementation of government-to-government consultation. And so this is done for all the tribes in California. And that tribal advisor is charged with a few things. One is to serve as a direct link between the tribes in California and the governor, and then to facilitate communication and consultations between tribes and state agencies. They review state legislation and regulations that affect tribes and provide recommendations as well. So the state takes a strong stance on consultations with tribes. And here's a quote from Governor Brown. The state and the tribes are better able to adopt and implement mutually beneficial policies when they cooperate and engage in meaningful consultation. And so that's the posture of the state. And now we shrink down to the county. The county has a few policies in the general plan. There's a few others, but because of time, I'm just going to focus on these two. One is the Native American Tribal Consultation, and the other is consultation on other historic preservation agencies and organizations. So here is the language for the Native American Tribal Consultation component, and it reinforces the idea that tribes shall be afforded the opportunity to review and provide comments to the county in regards to project review or planning or any other things that may impact known or unknown resources. And so it's even codified in the counties at the county level. In regards to consultation with other historic preservation agencies and organizations, we see even more language of correlating with not just the primary level of tribal consultation, but the secondary level as well. This involves the cultural and tribal cultural resources in regards to the advisory committee, the Northwest Information Center, the California Historic Resources Information Center, the State Office of Historic Preservation, and the Native American Heritage Commission, which I highly recommend. And so there's numerous, not only primary levels, but secondary levels for tribal consultation. So that was a really brief summary and overview of the federal, state, and county level. And then now let's dive into the project specific level. This is in regards to AB 52. So Governor Brown signed this in 2014, and it creates a whole new subject titled Tribal Cultural Resources, and it has to do with analyzing impacts that a project may have, and it requires the lead agency to consult with a federally recognized or state recognized tribe. And so we see that this also uses the Native American Heritage Commission consultation definition and contact list. And so that's a summary. And the intent of this is because tribes weren't directly included in the consultation process. And so by adding this, it's now created mandatory that tribes be contacted if they request it through the Native American Heritage Commission. And so we see that it gives the tribes an opportunity to review and to be consulted. Establishes a new category, which I mentioned earlier, called Tribal Cultural Resources. And it's to evaluate what the tribe views as important. The previous cultural resources were limited to archaeological definitions and doesn't really fit tribal concerns exactly. So that's why this whole new category was created. And it recognizes California Native American tribes as having the expertise in regards to their own tribal history, practices, and knowledge, and values and customs and everything. So it's no longer the archaeologist who's the expert, it's the tribes themselves as experts. So that's the intention of AB 52. What's not intended by AB 52 was an information exchange. In other words, it's limited information. The information needed to conduct AB 52 tribal consultations should be gathered in advance. In other words, the consultation process is limited to what impacts cultural resources on both sides. And the significant impact on identified tribal cultural resources cannot be adopted or certified until tribal consultation happens. And so AB 52 really empowers tribes on the consultation process. And because the state realized that this is important and it's needed. So AB 52 also presents some definitions. One is cultural landscapes. This is a new definition that has been attempted to capture what a cultural landscape and its importance and value is to tribes. And so here is a definition for that. And there's also ethnographic landscape, which it also attempts to define as well. And so these are two definitions that AB 52 provides in regards to the consultation process in evaluating and mitigating the impacts, that potential impacts. Well, another one is tribal cultural resource. There's a lot there. The PowerPoint can be provided to you after this. If you just email me asking for the PowerPoint, I can give it to you. But this just goes on to cultural resources, and these are the topics for the consultation with tribes. So these are what would be discussed. So the purpose of AB 52 consultation is first and foremost to avoid and preserve in place the resources. Then second is to treat the resource with culturally appropriate dignity. And so we see this hierarchy to avoid and preserve in place, then to treat with cultural character and integrity and traditional use and confidentiality. And then third is permanent conservation easements for the tribe and other interested parties according to the culture, what is culturally appropriate. And then fourth, protecting the resource, any level of protection not above. A lot of people go directly to compensation, and compensation should be really one of the last consultation purposes. And so it should be first avoidance and preservation in place, and you slowly work down from there. So the purpose is to avoid the impact by not taking the action or maybe part of the action. Second is mitigating impacts by limiting the degree or magnitude of the action and its implications. Rectifying the impact by repairing, rehabilitating, or restoring the impacted environment. Reducing or eliminating the impact over time by preservation and maintenance over the life of the project. So these are the purposes of consultation in regards to AB 52. Compensating for the impact of by replacing or providing substitutional resources for environment is also another component. Again, it should be towards the end as a last resort, not a first option. And all of these should come out of consultation, not proposed going into consultation. Upholding existing mitigation preferences for historic resource preservation in place. That should be the purpose. And public agencies shall, when feasible, avoid damaging effects to any tribal cultural resources. So these are all the purposes, and the desired outcome is this. The consultation must include the topics that are brought up in the tribal consultation. So any alternatives, mitigation measures that the tribe brings up, all of those must be included and addressed within a project. Consultation may include mitigation measures, including those capable of avoiding, substantially lessening the potential impacts. Alternatives can be included in the consultation in regards to AB 52, the type of review of significance and impacts and measures, preservation or mitigation that the tribe recommends. So these are the outcome of AB 52 consultation. AB 52 consultation concludes when either one of two ways. One is when the parties agree to the measures. That's the desired one that both sides should diligently seek. And so that is the first instance when the consultation concludes. The other one is when both parties, out of good faith, either on either side, reasonable effort, concludes that the mutual agreement cannot be reached. And again, this is something that both sides work towards within consultation. Neither side should have the predetermined outcome going in. And note that consultation can also be ongoing throughout the process. And so this is codified. You can see the public resource code number there. And a tribe may continue to submit information even after formal consultation ends. And so this has to do with AB 52 specifically on when consultation ends. So that was the project specific in relation to consultation, tribal consultation, specifically AB 52. And now let's move into local government, specifically SB 18. So this was brought in by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2004, and it requires cities and counties to contact and consult with California tribes before adopting or amending a general plan or an open space. And it's purely for the purpose of protecting the tribe's cultural places. During the preparation or amendment of the general plan, the planning agency shall provide opportunities for involvement for not only the citizens, but for the California tribes. The CNA stands for California Native American Tribes, and other community groups as well. And the intention behind SB 18 is that cultural places have a limited measure of protection, and SB 18 is to improve on that, to expand on that, and to provide a venue for that. Tribes have continuing cultural ties to the lands and their traditional heritage and their traditional lands. And so SB 18 is intended to help provide that protection and to keep that connection. Places are not located on tribal lands. So there's the intention, another intention of SB 18 is to, tribes can protect lands within the reservation and trust land and within the reservation boundary, but SB 18 expands that to include their traditional lands on lands that's not currently within trust land or reservation boundaries. And so it gives tribal governments that opportunity to chime in on their traditional lands. These places are essential elements in tribal cultural traditions, heritage, and identities. Many people think that tribes are confined to the reservation boundary, but that hasn't always been the case. And tribes' area of influence reaches beyond the reservation boundary, the current reservation boundary. For one, reservation boundaries have changed throughout history. Oftentimes they've gotten smaller, and we're beginning to see them expand a little bit to include more of their traditional lands. And so SB 18 was intended to provide tribes the opportunity to be consulted on what's important to them in traditions and heritage and the land. It also was intended to establish meaningful consultation between tribal governments and the local governments at the earliest possible point in the planning process. One conflict that we see with tribal consultation is either it seems to be too late and everything seems to be set and tribes feel like they just want a stamp of approval saying, please check this box for us. And that's not the intention of it either. And another one is that another feedback that I get a lot is that it seems too early in the process. We don't have a defined project description. We don't know the full area or the full level of impacts. And so most times consultation happens in either one of those realms, and ideally earlier the better, even when things aren't finalized. To be in the know is one thing, and to comment on the fine details is another thing as well. And so the intention is to establish meaningful consultation. Information available early in the planning process to avoid potential conflicts. And again, SB 18 is limited to cultural impacts and cultural resources. And this enables tribes to manage and act as caretakers of cultural places. And the non-intention of SB 18 is it does not include consultation with state or federal agencies. This is mainly for local governments. It does not cover activities on state or federally owned property. Again, it's not that the state and federal government can do whatever they want. It's just they have their own tribal consultation policies and criteria that they have to meet, which I briefly covered at the beginning. So SB 18 applies to local government. It does not include special districts, school districts, and water districts, and etc. Again, this is only local government. And it does not directly involve inadvertent discoveries, most likely descendants, and monitors. This is purely consultation. Those mitigation measures are typically for projects and different things like that, like AB 52 and other things. And so that's not really the intention of SB 18. Because there's a lot of confusion with tribal consultation, and they kind of mix everything with Section 106, AB 52, SB 18, and kind of view it, blend them all together and apply them across the board. But they're each unique with different purposes and different desired outcomes. SB 18 has its own definition of consultation. It's right here. It says it means a meaningful and timely process of seeking and discussing and considering carefully the views of others in a manner that is cognizant of all parties' cultural values and, where feasible, seeking agreement. And so this is codified in the law. In other words, this is the minimal requirement. Consultation between government agencies and Native American tribes shall be conducted in a way that is mutually respectful of each party's sovereignty. In other words, each governing authority, the tribe, needs to be respectful of the elected officials of the city, and the city needs to be respectful of the elected officials of the tribal government. Sovereignty is vital to this on both sides. And it's something I discuss in the Tribal Sovereignty and Introduction to Tribal Government. Consultation shall also recognize the tribe's potential needs for confidentiality with respect to places that have traditional tribal cultural significance. And again, this is all included in the language of the current existing law. And so this is the absolute minimal requirement that needs to be met on both sides when in regards to SB 18 consultation. SB 18 also defines cultural places, places, features, and objects described in sections, those in the Public Resource Code. It also defines open space land, and it talks about that as well. So there is a whole process to SB 18, and I tried to condense it as minimally as possible into the 7 steps. One is the general plan, specific plan amendment or update or adoption. First needs to be initiated. Then the local government contacts the Native American Heritage Commission for the list of tribal contacts. The third step in the process is the local government contacts the tribes regarding the general plan or specific plan, offering consultation based on the list received from the Native American Heritage Commission. So this invitation extends over 90 days. And so the tribe has 90 days to respond to this consultation invitation. The tribe can consult outside of this 90-day window. If it happens after the 90 days, it is most commonly considered a public comment. But if it happens within that 90 days, it's considered within the protections and rights of the tribal consultation process. And this is only for the initial consultation. In other words, once it needs to begin in that 90-day period, and it can extend as long as it needs to. There's no end cap date requirement codified in the law, so it can continue on as long as it's needed. Step number 4, government to government consultation happens, and it's open-ended purely for the purpose of consultation. No other purpose other than consultation in regards to cultural resource impacts. And so that's the consultation period. Not only that, but the local government needs to send a 45-day notice to the tribes of when that body is going to make a decision to approve or deny. And not only is there a 45-day notice, tribes should also be receiving a 10-day notice. And so that the local government should be sending that as well. And then the local government makes a decision to approve or deny the general plan or specific plan amendment, update, or adoption. And so this is the most boiled down, step-by-step process of SB 18. In the letter that is sent by the local government, by SB 18, it's suggested that local governments send a written notice with certified mail with a return recipient request. That's what is recommended by the Native or by the Historic Preservation Office. With today and with COVID, we do the best we can. I know a lot of correspondence is sent over email these days, but it is still recommended that a written notice be sent in addition to email. This letter includes a clear statement of purpose, the description of proposed general or specific plan or amendment, and the reason for the proposal, and the specific geographical areas affected. These are all things that should be included. A detailed map should also be included. Deadline dates for tribes should be included in the letter. In other words, everything should be spelled out for them, and government representative contact information should be provided in case there's any questions or comments and concerns could be submitted to them. And contact information for project proponent or applicant if applicable. In other words, the tribe should also have their contact information in case they have questions or concerns they want to ask them as well. These are all things that should be included in the SB 18 letter. So there is a purpose and a desired outcome to SB 18. And it is for the preservation of or the mitigation of impacts to places, features, and objects described within these public resource code sections. In other words, cultural places. That is the only purpose for SB 18 consultation. Anything outside of that, it's not what SB 18 speaks to. But SB 18 also speaks to providing for the protection of confidentiality. And this is codified in law as well. Information, specifically the information concerning specific identity, location, character, and use of those cultural places. So all of that is deemed confidential and is exempt from public inquiries. And so I put SB 922 in that as well, and I'll touch a little bit on confidentiality in a little bit as well. But procedures to facilitate voluntary landowner participation to preserve and protect the special identity, location, and character and use of those cultural places. And so that's all the purpose and desired outcome for SB 18. Anything beyond that is beyond SB 18. So here's one of the confidentiality I was going to elaborate on, and there's a public resource code there. But any kind of records of Native American graves, cemeteries, sacred places, and records of Native American places, features, and objects described in these public resource codes maintained or in the possession of the Native American Heritage Commission or any other state agency or local agency. These are all deemed confidential and exempt from public inquiries. And so confidentiality is spelled out and protected within SB 18. Another realm of confidentiality that SB 18 speaks to is the records that relate to archaeological site information and records maintained by or in the possession of the Department of Parks and Recreation, the State Historical Resources Commission, the State Lands Commission, any other state agency or local agency, including the records that the agency obtains through a consultation process. So in other words, any records received within the consultation process is deemed confidential between the tribe and the local agency. And so SB 18 really sets out and codifies to protect what the tribe deems as important within archaeological sites or lands, cultural resources. So there are some best practices. When going into SB 18 consultation, it's important to discuss guidelines before the consultation takes place. Because if both sides go into consultation just on the fly, who knows what will happen or where it will go. So it's important to discuss the guidelines before the consultation actually takes place. Local governments and tribal governments may want to meet on a regular basis. This is best practices to discuss common issues, concerns outside of the consultation requirements of SB 18. And so this is considered a best practice, and I'll be discussing this more in the other section next. And so there's within SB 18 and there's outside of SB 18. And so best practices includes consultation outside of SB 18. Local governments should consider incorporating policies into the general plan regarding SB 18 and consultation with tribal governments for the purpose of protecting cultural places. Again, that's solely for the purpose of protecting cultural places. That's what SB 18 is all about. And so a lot of cities take this stance. The county has incorporated some protection measures in cultural places. I mentioned those earlier. Local governments may want to work with tribes on developing protocols to be used for the notice and consultation requirements for SB 18. In other words, working to be on the same page of the notice and consultation. It makes it a lot easier when both parties are on the same page on what the expectations are, the process, and the steps of the consultation process. So here are some resources in regards to SB 18 tribal consultation. The Office of Planning and Research is a great resource. They provide a lot of guides and recommendations and handbooks. So I put their website and their phone number. Feel free to contact them with any questions. The Native American Heritage Commission is phenomenal. They have a lot of resources. They provide a lot of good advice as well. I put their website and their phone number there for your benefit as well. So as we are kind of cruising along through this, I wanted to not only just cover federal, state, county, project specific, and local government, but then there's also what happens to tribal consultation that happens outside of those, because each of those consultations are specific and they have a specific intent, purpose, and outcome that is defined within the law. So for consultation purposes that don't fit into either of those categories, there's a few things that are recommended. Well, for one, I can't provide exactly what should be done. It should be worked out between both parties. But what I can do is provide principles and guidance to help make that happen. One is to devise a protocol of consultation agreement. In other words, being on the same page of expectations, purpose, and outcome for the steps of the consultation process. Defining the terms and topics are so important. When someone says something, everyone could be thinking something different. So it's important to define the terms, just like I did with the illustration of dog. When I asked you to think of a dog, I don't know if you thought of either picture, you probably thought of something in between either of those extremes. But making clear any definitions, rules, processes, schedules of anyone involved, these are highly recommended. This helps streamline the process. This helps reduce the possibility of conflict arising. And I also recommend respecting time systems. Everyone has different concepts of time. I talked about this in my cross-cultural etiquette. And also being respectful of decision-making processes, not only for the city's decision-making process, but also for the tribes. Within the tribal sovereignty, tribal government, I covered their decision-making process and what that looks like and the time frame of that. And so it's important to be respectful on both sides. And also checking tribal consultation policies. A lot of tribes are starting to produce their own consultation policy, and cities are starting to produce their own tribal consultation policy. And so that is not a make or break. It's more of a starting point. So if there is no agreed upon consultation agreement, then that is the default. And so it's to provide some kind of guidance and structure to the consultation process. But ultimately, the mutually agreed upon consultation agreement is what should be sought after. So the consultation parties themselves will determine case-specific topics. In other words, there's no one size that fits all. Each consultation is going to be unique and different, and it should be realized and considered and accepted that that's going to be the case. That's why I can't provide specifics, but I can provide principles. And speaking of principles, outlaying the principles or standards of behavior of what is important. In other words, what's central or vital for the community. And this goes for both sides. The city should provide what's important for them, and the tribe should provide what's important for them. And just so the other side knows that, hey, this is the utmost important that we have to keep in mind. And it should be fact-based, again, case by case. What is important to the community? This involves a village or ceremonial or sacred sites with historical or cultural importance, again, on both sides. And so these are considerations that both sides have to make and keep in mind. And the lead agency may need to consult with more than one tribe. In other words, traditionally and culturally affiliated tribes. This includes the tribe that is closest, or the tribe that has their ancestral land, which is due to their historic tribe, or culturally affiliated tribes. Some tribes are broken up into different tribes, and I cover that in the cultural or tribal sovereignty presentation. And this is where the Native American Heritage Commission can assist and provide guidance and clarity and step forward, because there's geographical, there's kinship, there's archaeological, there's linguistic, there's traditional and historical ties within tribes. And so there's so many different facets and components. And the Native American Heritage Commission is tasked with making sure that all the tribes that need to be contacted are contacted. And understanding that leadership, decision makers, and representatives, who they are. In other words, understand who's staff and can make a staff level decision, understand who's a manager or director and who can make those kind of decisions, and understand what kind of decisions needs to make at the council level, or even at the citizen or tribal member level as well. And so understanding and being aware of that whole process on both sides, and some kind of liaison in between is recommended to help navigate that if needed. So some other things I recommend is getting to know the elected decision makers on both sides. Both the city and the tribes elect decision makers, and getting to know them. And I know this can be a hassle because they change often, every election cycle for both the city and the tribe. In support of all levels of tribal government as well. There's departments and even departments within the departments, committees. Some tribes have cultural committees and different things like that. And the different officer levels, there's a tribal historic preservation officer, there's the cultural department head. I mean, there's so many different levels as well. And so to understand and to keep that in mind is good in regards to tribal consultation. So also understanding that there are limitations in resources for both the city and the tribe as well. In other words, both the city and the tribe would like to either make things happen really quick or have things drawn out. And both need to understand the other government's limited resources. And again, that needs to be understood within the consultation agreement. Understanding agency pressures and objective constraints. In other words, as the city, you are bound to provide certain things to the city, and the tribe is bound and mandated to provide things to the tribe. And so understanding that that is the case on both sides, and understanding that some mutual agreement is good and beneficial and should be reached with those things in mind, I believe a greater understanding can help that consultation process. And it's important to have consistent contact people. As positions change, as job descriptions change, as workloads change, as projects change, I know it helps to have consistent contact people. And then to know the agency's ordinances, general plans, goals, and policies. This goes for both parties, not only the city, but the tribe as well. Each have their own long-range plans, their own short-range plans and goals and policies. And it's important to keep these things in mind. The tribe is not going to necessarily bend to the city on everything in regards to this, and vice versa. The city is not going to bend to all the tribe's general plans, goals, and policies. And so that's why consultation is so important on figuring out where things line up, where things don't line up, and how to progress forward in that. To build creative agreements and protocols, participation agreements, ordinances, and standard operating procedures. These are important. yes, agreements are good when things flow nicely and when everything lines up. But what's the protocol or standard procedures when things don't line up, when things disagree? There has to be a process that is agreed upon on, okay, how do we move forward from here? What does that look like? And so these are important things to consider in regards to tribal consultation. As we begin to wind this down a little bit, the landowner, applicant involvement is okay, but it has to be mutually agreed upon, and consultation with tribes should be ongoing. Comments, it's important to get comments in on time and in writing. And confidentiality. Confidentiality, as I mentioned, is so important in regards to location of cultural resources, and it's due to respect of tribal sovereignty and recognizing the need for confidentiality regarding sensitive tribal cultural resource information. And there's the codes there. And for that purpose, confidentiality should be agreed on beforehand. In other words, before the consultation takes place in person, the confidentiality agreement should be agreed upon and understood of what's covered in the confidentiality and what's not covered under the confidentiality. And understanding that there are confidential obligations that are extended and protected by law. So I know that was a lot of information, and it was the best I could squeeze into the time that we had. I wish I had an hour to talk about cross-cultural. I could spend actually days on that because that's my expertise. I could spend a day on the federal, state, and county level. I could spend a day on project specific. I could spend a full day on local, but I wanted to give a condensed version of all of this. And I know that not every tribal consultation fits nicely in each of those categories. And so I did my best to present any kind of principles that could be used to help in regards to a tribal consultation process. And so with that, I believe we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So now I'll leave it open to questions. Because I'm sharing my presentation, I can't really see anything but my presentation. So if Trevor, if you could ask any kind of questions over audio, I'd be more than happy to address any questions, comments, or concerns. And feel free to email me also. I'd be more than happy. And yes, this PowerPoint can be given. If you would just email me saying, hey, here's my thoughts on your presentation, and I would really like a copy of the PowerPoint. But with that, I'll open it to questions. And thank you again so much for your time. And again, I know this was a lot of information, so I thank you for that.
Ethan, we did get a few questions. One of them, this was recorded as you mentioned, and all participants will be getting a thank you for attending email, and it'll have a link. We'll put this onto YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it or share the presentation. There was a question about where did CUP3 come from, and I answered that with it's a Humboldt County General Plan, and I put a link to the general plan in the questions. There was a question about, Ethan, can a government-to-government consultation meeting be set up in a shorter than 90-day process?
Great question. Yes. So the 90-day window is the limit for when the tribe should respond back to the local government. In other words, that's when it should begin. It should begin no later than 90 days. And ideally, it should happen a lot sooner than that. And the tribe and the local government can agree on a shorter time frame. In other words, a tribe and a local government can say, hey, if we don't respond within 30 days, then we're not really, you can know that we're not really interested in the project. And so that really that streamlines that process. But the 90-day window is the maximum initial contact response. And it can, and ideally it should happen a lot sooner than 90 days for the initial contact and response.
You touched upon it, and I know you went in more detail on the tribal government section, but can't you just call up the TIPO and set up a meeting for next week?
It would be no different than trying to set up a meeting next week for the city. It's kind of understanding that both are kind of operate and function the same way. Just like it took a while for us to schedule this, it took 2 months to schedule this. Understanding that both governments are burdened with different tasks and are usually understaffed and overwhelmed, overbooked, overscheduled. So understanding that, yes, you can send an email asking to meet next week, but understanding that it may not exactly happen that quickly. The further out you can plan, the better, again, on both sides. And so understanding that both kind of have their limits, including tribes and including cities.
And some staff members have limitations that some decisions have to go to the council, and they may only meet once a month.
True. Yes, and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer may not be responsible for facilitating tribal consultation, but they may be a great place to start in regards to finding the person within the tribe, if you have no other contact. But it's important to understand that they may not always be involved. Typically, consultation is between government to government. In other words, the highest level of government and the highest level of government meet together. That is government to government relationship or consultation. And again, each highest level of government can delegate that role, responsibility, and authority to someone, but it needs to be spelled out that way and understood. And so that's government to government consultation process.
Thank you. I have another question here. I'll just read it. It's one concern I've heard expressed in Trinidad is that local government to government consultation may need to be confidential, but the people want to have open and transparent and public meetings. How have you seen this reconciled in the past?
Great question. So there's a presentation I'll be doing next year on confidentiality. And basically there are 3 levels of confidentiality. One is the absolute minimal required by law, and that's the legal confidentiality. In other words, there's no ifs, ands, or buts or exceptions to that, and it should be adhered to, and that's spelled out in some of the PowerPoints that I presented. But then there's another level, and apart from legal, there's moral. And so in other words, it's privileged information. It's a little bit above the minimal requirement. It's actually out of honor and respect that it's abided by on both sides for privileged information. And then above that is moral. I mean, there's moral and then there's ethical. In other words, providing that another level of confidentiality above the minimal requirement of law. And so that's something I'll dive more in depth on confidentiality. But moving forward, yeah, it's understanding that when there are a lot of people involved, that gives a preface that there are going to be some people that are not going to be pleased. And both parties need to figure out what's more important. Is pleasing the masses more important? Is mutually agreeing on steps forward more important? Is keeping silence more important? And so that's something that has to be worked out by both parties. And I would encourage both parties to sit down and have that hard conversation of what's important and how do we get that and keep that and honor that. And there may be disagreements arise. And one presentation I will do, if not next year, the year after, is on conflict management. What happens when you disagree? How do you go about reconciliation? What are some steps that can be taken to regain or rebuild trust, or different things like that? And it's a difficult place to be because you have to, you want to do the role that you're in, and that includes so many facets. But first and foremost is we all have to adhere to the law. So that's the first place to begin, is does the law dictate that on either side, whether it be the Brown Act on disclosure, whether it's covered in confidentiality and SB 18, AB 52, or anything else like that? Or is there some kind of mutual agreement that would provide precedents for that as well? So I can't speak to that specifically other than providing those options on steps forward. And I hope that is a good enough answer for now.
I think something that happens even in executive sessions is agreement between the two parties on what to report out.
Yes.
So that's also something that comes.
And even like the Browns Act in a closed session, what happens in the closed session can be deemed confidential, but they have to release, the final verdict, the final decision that was brought about. And so that could be something as well. And part of it is people don't need to know what's going on. For an example, I know that's bad to say. For an example, I, as an ordinary citizen, don't need to know things that our highest elected officials within the national government are basing their decision on. I can know some things, but I can't know everything. So there are privileged information, there are confidential information, and different things like that. And it's really finding where that very, very thin line is. And that line may change. And it has changed in the past due to new laws and policies. So also understanding that as well.
Okay, well, we've answered all the questions that have been asked. And again, well, thank you, Ethan, for this. And I know you're available for other questions and answers, and we will be sending out the link and with your email address as well. So, thank you very much.
Ethan, it's not really a question, but I think it would be really helpful for the city if we had some examples of protocols and agreements, if any are available, that maybe you could provide, like confidentiality agreements and consultation protocols. If we had some examples, that would be really helpful.
Yes, and I can provide some examples. And again, I can't encourage enough that, each relationship and agreement is so unique. So I do encourage the uniqueness in the agreement, but yeah, I can give you some tools and some ideas and some starting point for that. Yeah, I can send that.
Okay, well, thank you again, and thank you for participating. And I'm sure we'll be in touch.